Good morning, Ross. Thank you for having me on your show. I recently wrote a book called Risky Business in Rising China, which chronicles my 3 decades working in China. And my career in China basically spanned a period of time of market-oriented reforms. It might be called a golden age in China. And I want to emphasize that over that period of time of 3 decades, 800 million people were lifted out of poverty. And I wouldn't have missed that. That is probably one of the greatest events of our lifetime, even bigger than the fall of the Berlin Wall in Eastern Europe. And we can't pull up drawbridges between us and China. And I say that for a very simple reason, which is that the U.S. stake in the Chinese economy is enormous. And sometimes we lose sight of the fact that companies like Apple and Caterpillar and P&G, Boeing, all have major revenue coming out of the Chinese market. China is the world's largest semiconductor market, and many of our big names like NVIDIA and Qualcomm and Intel. Qualcomm has 2/3 of its revenue coming out of China. Those 3 companies have $50 billion of semiconductor revenue. Part of my point is that we can't walk away from China without a real cost to ourselves. And the last thing I'll say about why am I optimistic about China is that sometimes there's a misconception about China, which is that China is this big, monolithic, state-owned economy. And it's really not. From 1980 onward, the private sector in China grew from 0 to over 60% of GDP and 80% of urban employment. And private sector China is a hive of fast-moving, adaptable, flexible millions of entities with Chinese entrepreneurs chasing market opportunities and admittedly dodging government regulation. But Chinese entrepreneurs, they're ready to do deals with Americans. They're interested in working with us. They're interested in partnering with us.
Future Optimist.
It's a pleasure to have you on the show, and that's the viewpoint that I wanted to hear from, because China is this very interesting thing in the minds of most Americans, and it's changed in my lifetime. It's changed in the last 5 years. I also spent several weeks in China a few years ago on 2 separate occasions, traveled a good bit around the country for 3 weeks on one trip, 2 weeks on another trip, and I feel like I got to see a lot of the places that were off the beaten path. But in American psychology, pop culture, there is a rise and fall. A few years back, there was this huge collaboration in the movie sector. I'm obviously based in LA, the entertainment industry, talking about a collaboration with China and Marvel and getting all these movies, and then we pulled back from that. Now we're talking about we need to divest ByteDance from TikTok because we're really afraid of Chinese governmental influence in American politics and life. There are accusations of the dumbification of Americans via platforms like TikTok, whereas in China, their alternative platform is much more limited and it's more educational in nature. And here it's just stupid dances to make us all dumb and chase the wrong things. There they limit their social media exposure for their kids to 1 hour per day max. Here they flood it just to make us like, there are so many different things that China has meant. It's been scary. It's been a land of opportunity. Also, 10 years back, it was this, you can have any widget made, any Alibaba widget made. You want a yoga mat? Make it cheap, put your logo on it, sell it on Amazon, get rich quickly that way. And then that's fading away. So I've seen the ebb and flow of our perception of China and its utility and usefulness and how we feel about it in my lifetime. You have had a front row seat for 3 decades, and that is a very unique perspective. So how have you seen China change over that time?
Yeah, no, very good story. Let's talk about the electric vehicle sector, because that's a really hot one, particularly in terms of how Americans feel about China threatening our automotive industry.
Yeah.
You know, in the old days, the automotive sector of China was a completely state-owned activity, and you had big state-owned companies like First Auto Works, Second Auto Works, partnering with VW, General Motors, Toyota, and cars were made in China, relatively boring. Through these joint ventures, everything was internal combustion. And everything would basically look like the cars on the road in the United States. And then if you fast forward to about 10 years ago, the Chinese government started drip feeding subsidies and other things in for electric vehicles. But it wasn't, the central government of China wasn't leading this. And what was happening was small private sector companies, including BYD, which started as a battery maker for mobile phones, small private companies started jumping in and trying to put together various types of product offerings. I'm ashamed to admit that I was actually part of that with a U.S. company. We had a company called Coda Automotive, and unfortunately, we were about a decade too early getting into the electric vehicle world. But the idea was China had this very strong foundation for lithium-ion battery production. Logically, it made sense to combine that with inexpensive car making. And now, if we look what happened, and this is very characteristic of many industries in China. So the private sector guys led the way, and you started having all kinds of offerings. And the central government eventually dawned on them that China could leapfrog other traditional automakers by jumping directly into the electric vehicle sector, because China wasn't very good on the internal combustion engine side, and they didn't really know automatic transmissions. So we had a lot of hundreds of private sector companies jumping in. A lot of them were just chasing government subsidy. Most of them went bankrupt. But today we have about a dozen companies, including BYD leading the pack. And one of the things that China benefits from today is they've always been they've been a big powerhouse in IT and consumer products. Obviously, Apple makes everything there. So having guys who are similar to Silicon Valley engineers, guess what? Chinese electric vehicles start to look like Tesla. So now where we are today is the electric vehicle sector in China is really representative of private sector strength. Almost all the offerings are really private sector. And here's where I think things will change. I think that the herd activity of jumping into the sector was very representative of what has happened in many industries. Ross, think about solar panels, think about lithium-ion batteries in general, think about all kinds of consumer products. If you go to Best Buy, every TV in there is basically one Chinese company or another.
Okay. Yeah, right. All of Amazon.
Yeah, this is what's happened in electric vehicles. But I think where we may be heading now is the following, is that Tesla is or was the most valuable car company in the world. And Tesla has a factory in China, and Tesla also has an okay market share. It's a little bit less than 10%. And here in America, Tesla has 55%, and there's not a whole lot of other alternatives. And so we are now wrestling with, do we let this tsunami of Chinese EVs into America? And I would say we should go back to basically 40 years ago when Toyota, Nissan, and Honda were looking to get into the U.S. And admittedly, in those days, the Japanese car companies had affordable, high-quality cars, something that consumers thought was pretty attractive. And I think that consumers would look at Chinese EVs today and they say, for the price, this is a bargain. So I think what we should do, Ross, is we should think back to how do we create a set of incentives and potentially penalties that cause the Chinese EV makers to come and produce their cars in the U.S. And the future that I'm thinking of is one where we see more private sector Chinese entities begin to bridge themselves into the U.S. And how do we benefit? We benefit, one, from jobs. The second is that we actually become more competitive. And we saw this when the Japanese came to the U.S., that they're now fully integrated into the U.S. auto industry. And GM and Ford and Chrysler all became better companies, better managed, partly by following that example. You know, it's funny, Ross, I was in a conference a few weeks ago, and I heard a panel of Chinese venture capitalists talking about what they invest in. And interestingly enough, what they said was, we invest in Chinese entrepreneurs, but not in China.
Interesting distinction.
So they're investing in Chinese entrepreneurs in America and other countries.
Yeah. Huh. You know, it's funny you mentioned the Japanese auto example, because my grandpa fought in World War II, and he would never have driven, he died, but he would have never driven a Japanese car because of his experience in World War II. I think something similar is happening with people in Chinese electric vehicles at this moment in time. Maybe it's not as visceral or immediate, but there is that sense of danger, watch out, what's going to happen, or maybe even lower quality. You did bring up an interesting point about entrepreneurship, and this is something that I would love to talk about since you mentioned you're in Marin County. You're basically near Silicon Valley where all of these things are happening.
Yeah.
People who love Silicon Valley culture, they love this work all the time. We champion Apple. Speaking of, we say they were working 100+ hours a week to get the original Macintosh out, and that's great. And Reid Hoffman in his book Blitz Scaling, he talks about, we didn't want to hire people at LinkedIn in the early days who were just there for a 9-to-5 job. We wanted people who would do 9 to 5, go eat dinner, and then come back and work from 7 until midnight. That's what we need. That's Silicon Valley culture, to work all the time. Chinese culture is always lauded as being 996. They're always in the office, and that's great. That's how they're able to get so much more done than we are. And on the flip side, you have that documentary, I think it was called American Factory or something like that, shows
Right.
a Chinese in the United States. And the average American worker looks at that and they're just like, it seems like literal hell. Says, oh my God, a foreign overlord is going to come in and tell me that I need to be in my office for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, or else I'm a bad employee. That seems one step shy of being an indentured servant or being in jail. And to us, when we think about the American way of life, for many of us, that kind of encroachment is the thing that we fear the absolute most. So how do you feel about this different concept of work culture and dedicating one's life to work?
It's a very good question. And I recently read the biography about Elon Musk. Isaac.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a great book.
Came out. Yeah. Elon has this habit of shocking whether it's Tesla or SpaceX. He'll go and he'll sleep in the factory,
right.
and he'll go machine by machine, and he'll figure out, how do we optimize this process? And one side of me, Ross, having come from manufacturing, so in my book, Risky Business, I talk about spending a pretty significant amount of time in factories in China, that one side of me really appreciates the fact that the owner and CEO of Tesla and SpaceX personally goes to the factory and sorts out those problems. And just by the way, guess what? You look at Boeing, and a lot of Boeing's problems are due to the fact that they stopped looking at what was going on in the factory, and they started returning cash to shareholders. And now they're in a deep hole of quality problems. So one side says, okay, here in America, we do have to accept the fact that we need to pay attention to the processes, we need to pay attention to the quality. And that's never going to go away. And that's an effort that if you choose to manufacture things in America, you have to step up and do that. I would say, on the other hand, let's talk about a different view related to innovation and initiative. So one of the things I experienced, and again, this came from working in factories in China that I describe in the book, that Chinese workers don't necessarily have initiative to go to the boss and say, look, this is how I think we can improve the process. There's not that type of culture. And in China, the management situation, and obviously the educational world, is very much teacher down to student, shop manager down to the workers, and you basically keep quiet and do what you're told. And that's a real problem, because in the world of advanced manufacturing, you do need to have deep participation and collaboration. And I have found that Americans, regardless of their educational pedigree, we have a culture of asking questions, of basically accepting feedback from all parts of the organization. So I would say, I think having Chinese companies come to America, it won't be like the movie that you described. It will tend to be a hybrid, and that Chinese owners will adapt to figure out how to leverage the strengths of the American workforce.
That makes sense. And I think it's an interesting thinking about the American culture, my perception of it anyways, is that we're a very pioneering entrepreneurial spirit, and I think we're more than willing to work those types of hours if it comes from our own initiative. If I'm running my own business, I may work more than those hours, and I often do, but I have a sense of being in control. The minute that somebody tells me I have to work 996, I will fight tooth and nail. I was like, don't mandate this. I'll do it anyways. I'll work 7 days a week, but I have to have the illusion of that control, of freedom, basically, to do what I want. And I think that, especially to like a union worker, is terrifying.
Yes.
So one of the cool things about the arc of your book, and again, 3 decades, describe the scene when you first arrived. So 1982, right? This is many years ago. You graduated from Yale and then MIT. What brought you to China at such an early age? Why were you so ahead of that curve? And how did you end up spending so much of your life there?
Yeah. And I would say that my contemporaries at the time really wondered what I was doing with my future.
It wasn't in vogue, I'm sure.
So I'll dial back to about 80 years ago. My grandfather, just prior to World War II, was an officer in the U.S. Navy. And in those days, he was stationed far out in Asia, where in the summers of 1938 and 1939, he would sail to Qingdao, which is a city in eastern China in Shandong province. And Qingdao, by the way, is also the brand of the Chinese beer.
Yes.
Yeah. So my father, as a 12-year-old, would go and stay in Japanese-occupied China. And this is described in an appendix in my book that my uncle wrote. And so my father had a very deep impression by what was going on in Asia. And of course, the whole drama of World War II, followed by the resurgence of Japan as a major economy in the world. And so my father's observation of that was that, wow, Asia is a land of opportunity. And this is something certainly worth pursuing in terms of opportunity in Asia. I studied at Yale University. I studied electrical engineering, and then I took Chinese on the side. And my family took a family tour in 1982. And so picture yourself as a college freshman arriving on some almost completely empty Pan Am 747 in the dead of winter. And the plane is taxiing to the terminal, and outside are these Chinese soldiers in padded overcoats and fur hats and AK-47s.
Very welcoming.
Breath in the air.
It's exactly what you want to see in the middle of winter.
It's exactly what Hollywood would use to depict North Korea.
Like, oh, no.
And then we
what got myself
town.
into?
Yeah. And then we rumbled into town in some ramshackle bus on a cracked concrete road. This is way before all the development in China. And so what we saw in 1982 was Chinese people in threadbare outfits riding simple black bicycles. And things were very communal back then. People were basically living out of communal kitchens, and no tall buildings, no neon, no cars. But despite all that, and just by the way, in my book, I describe how as part of that trip, I had an appendectomy occur, which gave me a real shocking upfront view of Chinese medicine in 1982. But in the 1980s, there was this drumbeat of Western media talking about how companies like Procter & Gamble and Coca-Cola and Boeing were beginning to build a presence in the China market. And it was exciting. It was the opposite of Japan because, as you remember, in the 80s, Japan was already this juggernaut of economy, sending cars and appliances and other things to the United States. But China was this sort of mysterious large country that was just opening up. And I chose to go there, and little did I realize, and in fact, there is a chapter in my book where I diverged temporarily to work in Japan in the final bubble years. So I worked for Sony Corporation, and I was a drone, Japan Incorporated. And I have to say, Roth, by the way, that experience was nowhere near as fun as being in early development China. China was just much more of a wild east, crazy new development environment. It started with street vendors selling blue jeans and pirated music.
Right.
And T-shirts,
right?
and then it just kept moving. And I describe in the beginning of my book this concept of China's development or modernization was like the building of a tsunami that just kept building and building.
No kidding.
And you could ride that wave, and so the opportunities that came along were endless. You could basically jump from one thing to another relatively easily. There was only one transition that occurs about halfway through my book where I moved from traditional industrial jobs where I was running factories in China to, it dawned on me at about age 40 that local Chinese managers were getting pretty good at managing manufacturing. And I needed to get out of that, reinvent myself. And so anytime you move into something completely new, there's always the problem that nobody wants to hire you and you don't really have the background. So I created an opportunity with two other guys where we set up an investment fund and we focused completely on the mobile sector in China. So we focused on entrepreneurial teams who were basically at the startup phase of, they were doing things like they were, in some cases, they were installing new technology platforms in the Chinese carriers. In other cases, they were actually doing actual business models of services. The classic one of the 1990s was, think about American Idol. And when, in the old days, when you voted, you sent a vote via text.
I voted every
in
time.
China, So in China, I described one of the most profitable businesses we were in was we were running the voting platform for a program called Supergirl.
Okay.
And Supergirl at one time in one season had 800 million votes.
Wow.
And so we were making a commission on the price of each of those.
Wow.
And the only thing, by the way, Ross, this is very telling of China, is the thing that eventually killed that opportunity was that the Chinese government began to realize that this was an enormous exercise in direct democracy. And they began to worry that the same technology for sending your vote via text could be used to solicit the public's opinion about Chinese leadership. And what would happen if they put out a vote one day that said, is the leader of China a good person or a bad person?
Right.
And 800 million people gave him a thumbs down.
Oh, no. That's bad optics for you. That's real bad.
So they killed that. But yeah, so that was so I moved on then from manufacturing to investing and then other types of tech businesses.
That's so fascinating. And at the beginning of this talk, you talked about raising 800 million people out of poverty, no small feat. And coming from that scene, rural, it is hard to contemplate how far it has come and how recently modern China was not modern China and how recently it was a vastly different place. In that movie, which I hope is called American Factory because it's been a while, something like that, one of the Chinese business owners, there's a wistful moment in that, if you recall, where he talks about how as a child he used to play at the stream and now it's overrun with pollution and smog. And you can tell there's a hint of regret. And he says, yes, I am a very successful business person. I've amassed great wealth. I've done all of these things, but at what cost? And sometimes people wonder whether the extreme cost, the human cost, the environmental cost, the resource cost, whether it was worth it or not, whether the end justified the means. Do you have any opinion on that as we look? I know this story is still developing, but do you think it was a smart thing?
I would say the point you made about the guy being wistful for a past that was relatively unpolluted. Chinese people in 60 years old and above obviously would have memories of a chaotic time in China through the Cultural Revolution, and that was characterized by class struggle and crazy focus on ideology. And the one thing that I sometimes hear people say is that when you compare it back then to today, everyone of the 1960s was equally destitute. And so in that world, there wasn't a lot of envy. There was no inequality because everyone was equally poor. And so some of my friends describe this similar situation of playing in the neighborhood, and there was no distinctions from one person to another. But let's not forget the fact that there was incredible levels of cruelty and terrible things happened during the Cultural Revolution where the mob was basically encouraged to attack people with any type of skills or any type of intellectual capability. So if we fast forward to today, so these 60-year-old friends and above, they went from a pittance, basically Your job was allocated to you. You had to go to some work unit. The place you lived was allocated to you. You pretty much were operating off of food coupons, like food stamps. And today they own a couple apartments, they own nice cars. And more importantly, the most important thing that happened is that people who had no control over their future ended up in a world 30 years later where they were able to pursue their aspiration and to do the things that they wanted to do and try to become the things that they wanted to be. And so I would say, Ross, for that reason, that justifies some of the dirty, polluted paths of getting there. And admittedly, it was pretty terrible. And I think just thinking about India, unfortunately, India may be heading in that same direction as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I do say that I think people's freedom to choose what they do and what to pursue is definitely justifies where they came from.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. You mentioned the fear of the democratized voting mechanism, which is hilarious that it would have occurred in such a way. But that's something that I think comes to mind for me and many others, having experienced the quote-unquote Great Firewall of China, this fear of we can't have Facebook here, we can't have Google. So all of these American technologies are banned, and obviously WeChat is ubiquitous, and Chinese technologies are promoted. Clearly, that is a fear-based decision at the highest level, fear of what might happen if you let Facebook and Google. And I don't know if that's more of a cultural fear or an influencing of public opinion or more of just a power fear, but there does seem to be that ubiquitous fear of this type of thing. Why do you think that is so prevalent? Why is that fear the motivating factor for a lot of the higher level decisions?
Yeah, good question. I think it's a combination of two things. One is China is an authoritarian country it's a one-party state. And the Communist Party of China, the most overriding objective is to keep themselves in power. And that actually is more important than even the well-being of the people. Although one would assume that at some point you have to take care of the well-being of the people in order to stay in power. But so I think one is a structural issue of a single-party state. The other is that in Asia, and maybe applies not just to China, but also to maybe Japan and Korea and some of the other East Asian countries, is that there is always a concern about things that cause chaos and what does chaos do to society.
Interesting.
Even think about the fact that in Singapore, which itself is supposed to be a democracy and a pretty transparent, almost like Western-style society, there's still a fair amount of censorship. And there's still a fair amount of restriction, even in Singapore.
Don't spit your gum on the ground. That's all I know.
Yeah.
Do not.
Yeah. So one thing that a lot of people probably don't realize is we do hear about how the Chinese surveillance state is comprehensive. And it is. I've heard the statistic that the Chinese spend more on domestic security than they do on defense. So they're basically spending more to keep their own society under control than they are worried about having to fend off attacks from other countries. And so that's very telling. China, it is also for sure, if you look back at Chinese history, that it's been one dynasty after another, and dynasties tend to fall when chaos breaks out. And so the Chinese are very sensitive to that historical lesson, which is that if you let chaos become uncontrolled, it really threatens the central authority. So I think, it's to their disadvantage. I personally feel, Ross, I think I said this towards the end.
You did. I was going to say.
Yeah, you can't be a superpower. You can't be a superpower rubbing elbows with America if you can't deal with having Google and Facebook and YouTube in your own country. Part of developing a vibrant society and leading edge in technologies is you have to have the free flow of ideas. And that's, for America, that's a major strength.
Yeah. And there are many analogs to this, but sometimes when we act, if I'm very distrustful of you, for example, if I go far enough, then you are going to be triggered to be distrustful of me. And if I'm so worried about having your social media platform in my country, if I'm so terrified of what Facebook would mean if it was in my country, and then you're talking about banning TikTok, one that I own, then you have to ask, why are you so afraid of Facebook? Is it because you are using this? Is it you're so sure that Facebook is a weapon? Why are you so sure? Because you're using it as a weapon? At a certain point, you have to ask that question. Whether it's true or not, I'll never know. I don't think any of us will ever know what's going on under the hood of TikTok or Facebook or Google or any of these gigantic corporations. But there is that element of, should we be as afraid of TikTok as you appear to be? And then that's how you get into that lifting up the drawbridge mentality, which you said is leading to bad outcome. That's what we don't want. We want to keep the exchange going, because either way, either they're going to sell it or they're going to divest. I don't know what's going to happen, but it's representative of a much larger issue, I think. Yeah.
And so I was in this conference recently about peaceful coexistence with China, and a Chinese guy in the audience, a Chinese student in the audience, raised his hand, and he said, "Why are you Americans couching everything in terms of belligerence, and why are you threatening China?" And it's an interesting perspective, because we as Americans, we don't think of them having that perspective. We don't think of our reaction to China as being belligerent or warmongering. But I would say, I mean, if you look at the relationship, certainly, and you made this comment at the start of this, is that the last 5 years, Xi Jinping has done a lot to change Chinese policy and has done a lot, I believe, to actually promote conflict with the United States. And our policy, unfortunately, is a reaction to that.
Yeah.
But we're certainly feeding off each other's distrust at this point.
And that is another interesting point that I've witnessed firsthand, this 5-year plan that China has. What's crazy about having a single party or authoritarian, however you want to call it, things move fast. Boy, don't they move fast in China. They make a decision, they say, next 5 years we're doing this, and then whoosh, it just goes. There's no dissent, there's no counter voice, it just goes. This 5 years, we're opening up our borders. We love the U.S. Collaborate. Next 5 years, we don't want to do that anymore, and just jump. It's over. Things just change. And then who knows what the next 5 years are going to bring? Is it going to switch? So there is that sort of mercurial or hard to predict nature, I think, of all of this that I've seen. And it again makes it difficult to know what are the priorities going to be. Or I think that from my perspective is sometimes confusing or surprising from a system that moves very slow, where everything is an issue, everything is debated. We make progress and then go backwards decades later. How do you feel about this 5-year plan and having experienced a bunch of them?
Over 30 years, multiple 5-year plans. Yeah. And I would say that the Chinese government is probably given too much credit for the growth of the economy. And again, I would just say that the private sector is really responsible for initiating a lot of the growth in the economy over that period. But where we're at today, Ross, is that China is starting to suffer the consequences of some structural problems that were created, in some cases, decades ago. And the best example of that, Ross, is the property sector, is that the Chinese created this wealth-creating industry that everybody, certainly all the urban middle class, participated in and became truly wealthy, at least on paper. Americans might be surprised to realize that relatively small size apartments in China go for $1 million, and that houses in China can be priced like houses in California. It was a machine of wealth creation for people who bought houses or invested in property. But the problem is it became so successful that it just became speculative. And by any measure today, it's run out of control of the central government, is that the values of Chinese real estate are so far overvalued by any measure of income relative to what we have here in the United States, even higher than New York or San Francisco. And so,
Angeles or
yeah, so so there's a reckoning going on, and the central government cracking down on the over leverage of developers is not going to solve the problem
Mm,
because the overhang of unsold properties plus all the vacant properties that people own are still sitting out there. And just to give you an idea of scale, we're talking about empty properties that could be anywhere from 60 million additional people housed to hundreds of millions. And so
wow.
the property problem will go on for years. And it is an issue. So this is a case where no 5-year plan is going to solve the current property problem. And so this is why China is now throwing lots of resource into subsidizing electric vehicles and solar panels and batteries and all the other things they can manufacture. But China already has the second structural problem they have is this herd-like activity that I talked about before, that
Mm,
just huge overcapacity in one industry after another.
mm,
And overcapacity where car making in China is probably double what the domestic demand needs. And Europe and America are not willing to pick up that surplus by having it dumped in our markets. And I would just tend to agree with the U.S. government and the European government that, yeah, we shouldn't be importing cars that are massively subsidized or other products that are massively subsidized. China has to figure out. China's big problem is the next year 5-year plan is like, how do we allocate additional income to private Chinese citizens so that they can spend more? So
on the appendix of your book, yeah.
yeah. So I would say we are at a turning point where I think the wisdom and the all-knowing capability of the central government is really being called into question.
Mm. Yeah, that's truly fascinating. And I'm sure you were captivated. One thing I've always said, everywhere you travel, people are lovely. And my travels throughout China I was met with great hospitality, great food, lots of incredible, caring people. I had a wonderful time. The pollution was devastating on my body. Physically, it was an enormous toll and very difficult, but the culture and the people, they really opened their hearts, they opened their homes, and that's always the case. Somebody will say, "Oh, here's some drink, here's some food, eat some hot pot, come join us. Oh, you like spicy foods, do you?" Talking about Sichuan province. "Have some of this. Can you eat that?" And I love that. I live for that type of thing. And I experienced that very much when I was in China. And that is always the best part of traveling and experiencing other cultures. There's a huge gap between any individual citizen, the government, trends. Many people are just doing the best they can. Just like we're not responsible for our government here, no individual Chinese citizen is responsible for what their government does or doesn't do. And I
Yes.
think, when you experience that, it's harder to demonize another culture because you recognize what's going on. One of the parts that I found fascinating, you talked about the total surveillance state, and that is hard to get away from. I think sometimes I like to have philosophical discussions like this. It's basically who I am with anybody, especially when I travel. And I'm by no means a person who says the United States is perfect, everything we do is amazing, and always without fail. I'm happy to discuss what we do well and what we don't do well, what I like about it, what I don't like. I think every place has pros and cons. And people at that time would say, "Oh yeah, Trump this or that, you guys have problems." And I would say, "You're right, we do. Not
Yeah.
going to argue with you there." But there is this sense when you ask somebody their opinion of, can they actually say what they mean? Certainly not on WeChat. I've learned that. Don't ask somebody, "What do you think about the government?" on WeChat. You will not get a reply other than, "I love it." So there is
Right.
that. Are you saying what you actually believe? And I think we have that with Russia today as well. It's like, do you like Putin? Yes. Yes, I do. I love him. Do you? I do. Are you sure? Yes. And I did get a little bit of that. So how have you gotten to the heart of what real Chinese people feel about their situation over 3 decades? Have you been able to penetrate that great firewall or still not?
Good question. You're right from the perspective that people really don't want to be public about expressing their opinions. So they're certainly not on WeChat or in any kind of public forum. Privately, people understand that the Chinese government doesn't really it doesn't monitor, and it probably doesn't really care what you say to somebody else at a lunch or a dinner.
Mm.
What I have found is there are differences across the generations. And so think about it like this, that the older people, so anybody, again, who's over 60, saw a brutal period of China's history and are probably a little bit more cynical. And for example, when Xi Jinping decided that he was going to just take another term and extend his time as the paramount leader of China, that generation would say that's probably not a good sign in terms of the direction the country's going. The younger generation, I talk about this in the afterword, is that their problem is that they have only experienced economic growth almost their entire life without any real major downturns. And so that has given them let's say, a stronger belief in the capability of the central government and probably a greater sense of patriotism.
That makes sense. I buy that. That's a
Yeah.
good take.
I would say, though, that in this current tense environment between the United States and China, what I have found is that some of my older Chinese friends who live in North America or Europe, who are subjected to Western media on a daily basis saying China's bad and this is bad and that's bad, they do have a reaction now, which I think is motivated by pride, which is that if you put yourself in a Chinese person's shoes, they're like, look, again, we came from total destitution, poorer than India 30 years ago, and look where we are today. Look how far we've come. And then there's that 500-year view, Ross, that says 500 years ago, China was the dominant economy in the world.
Right. There's a lot of history there.
The Chinese do pay attention to that type of time span. There was a joke, you might have heard this before, but I think somebody asked Deng Xiaoping, the first guy to start reforming China, somebody asked Deng Xiaoping, what do you think of the French Revolution? And he said, it's too early to tell.
Yeah. You get a sense of that in the Buddhist temple. It goes deeper than an American will ever understand. That's for sure. We have no concept of that culturally. They've been at it for a long time.
Yeah, can I just throw out just one comment about what I've learned coming back to America?
Mm-hmm.
In my final years of China was starting to turn inward and starting to crack down on, like you said, on foreign social media and other things. And the internet became very censored. And one of the things that I really grew to appreciate, and this may sound somewhat cliched, but I really grew to appreciate the fact that here in America, we have checks and balances, and we have a government that's basically set up to prevent any crazy person from really taking over. And
knock on wood,
the
yeah.
result of knock on wood, we still have to prove it
extremely
sometimes.
crossed. Yes.
My point being that if you were a citizen of China, one of the sort of depressing realities is that people in power in the central government, they don't go away. They're not changed, and you can't change them. And one of the perks of being in the central government of China is that you get all kinds of special favors and franchises and monopolies that allow you to make a ton of money. And over the course of that time in China, many Communist Party members have become millionaires and billionaires. So,
right.
Big difference, I think.
Deck is stacked. And you do touch on that level of corruption. There's a lot about this book that we won't get to about experiencing corruption. Of course, when you talk about the Wild East, you talk about this boundless opportunity, the chance for corruption. I love where you talk about the duality between wearing these rags on the office floor and siphoning millions from factories, the duality between pretending to adhere to these minimalist vibes, but then in private life having fancy cars and siphoning as much money as you can. So there's lots of good nuance, I think, in your story, which is well worth a read. And another point that I don't think we'll be able to get to, but the issue of the aging population and the desire for the not attractiveness to have children for some of the younger generation, because you mentioned that the paycheck simply isn't high enough. The disparity between the top layer and the average citizen is so great, and the average younger person is taking care of their parents in an apartment, and they just simply don't have the resources to be thinking about having kids, which is an issue that we see in several places around the world. So it's going to be interesting to see how that develops, but it's too early to tell on that front too, right? What's that going to do in 50 years?
Yeah, here we are. We sit in California, and we can see directly, I feel, the benefit of immigration. Yeah.
Best part of this place.
We see very capable people in Silicon Valley who are driving the leading edge of technology. Some of our most valuable companies are run by guys from India.
Yep.
And you look all through the California economy, and we benefit from people at all levels coming in. Agriculture of California is basically driven by people coming up from the South. And they're the ones who are willing to be out in the field and harvest it. China does have this problem. I saw a statistic this morning, Ross, that said that in 2035, roughly 10 years from now, China will have 400 million people over the age of 60.
Oh, I've seen those types of graphs.
Depressing.
Yeah, that's... I've seen those
more
charts,
than everybody in
and you're like,
America.
I don't know much about charts, but I know that doesn't look great. I've seen that demographics chart. You're like, okay. But for the record, Mexico's looking. There's that. The United States is okay.
Yeah. So no, the aging thing is an issue, but this is also true of all of Asia. Right. Is that the fertility is really low right now?
Well, work in progress. I know we've gone over our hour here, and I'm very appreciative of your time. I think it's a fascinating story. Obviously, the disclaimer is this is one man's look at a country, and two foreigners talking about a country. We don't know everything about it, but I think there's some meaningful discussion to be had. It's really rare that you come across somebody who has such in-depth knowledge about something like this. And I think at a time like this, that in-depth knowledge is very valuable, because if we're just living from social media sound bites and news articles, we're not getting the whole story. And very few people have seen that story develop over 3 decades. So I think it's super cool. And let's, of course, not forget to plug the actual book itself.
There it is.
Very
there
good.
It is. Perfect.
Risky Business and
You
Rising
can find
China.
it on Amazon.
There we go. The most important part of the entire podcast. The reason we're here.
One of the things I would like to leave the audience with is 2 things. One is that, again, America has a really big stake in markets in China. And so we do benefit a lot from China's development, and we sell them a lot. And then the second thing is, I think that we can benefit from working with the Chinese. I mentioned the idea of bringing Chinese EV makers to the U.S., but China's here to stay. China in the world of AI and many leading technologies, it's not going to go away. I don't think that China will have a collapse or a lost decades the way Japan did, only for the reason that China is so big, and the technologies that it is good at are also technologies that we strive to create. So I see a lot of opportunity in partnering, working together. So one of my hopes, you saw this, I think, at the end of the book. I hope that young Americans do something to engage. Like you, take a trip there. You can learn the language, or you can find an internship. People should remember that if you work for Apple, there are lots of jobs in China. If you work in Tesla, they have a whole factory over there. So there's a lot of activity where you can work for American companies in China, or you can work for Chinese companies in America. But I think for young people, please try to engage with the country.
Completely agree. And I'm all about human connection, bridging the gap, humans meeting eye to eye. I dream of a day when we all consider ourselves global citizens, because from outer space, you don't really see countries too well.
Totally agree.
I can't wait until we recognize that we're all on this little rock floating through infinite space. But until then, we'll do the best we can. And I think people like you bridging that gap and being open to that kind of opportunity, there is extreme value in that. And I think you've also shown opportunity in that, taking the path that others aren't necessarily willing to take or excited to take could yield some incredible benefits, both in terms of business and in terms of life. So thanks, Mark, for taking the time. Great insights. I really appreciate it. With that, the official podcast is over.